Ooh, excellent. I do believe I am streaming. Could it be? Oh, yes. Excellent. Everything looks the way it should. Hoping this goes well. Excellent. Welcome, students. Hope you're doing great. It's Thursday. You guys are on top of the world. You just did a DBQ yesterday. Excellent job. Good job getting that in. If you didn't get it in, come see me. Send me an email. Reminder that there is no school tomorrow on Friday for Good Friday. And then there is school next week. And next Wednesday, we have the Unit 8 short answer test. Next Thursday, we have the Unit 8 multiple choice test. Okay? Excellent. Here we go. We got a lecture for you. I know you love them. That's why I keep making them. Excellent. So today is April 1st. We're looking at the end of the Cold War. Our objective for today is to learn about the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. Those two things go together. And that makes sense because the Cold War is this competition between the capitalist states and between the communist states of the world. Right? That's right. Excellent. I think you can see that pretty clearly. Excellent. So capitalists, we've got them in our map here in green. We also call it the First World. That's also NATO, this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Those are all the West. Those terms are all talking about the same groups of states. The United States is the #1 biggest capitalist country. Because they're capitalists, they favor private property. They like to be able to trade. And then the more capitalist states there are, the more states there are for them to trade with each other, right? Free trade states want to have free trade. The more states that are involved in free trade, the more opportunity they have to trade. So that's why the United States and other capitalist states encourage and support each other in their capitalist economy and capitalist policies. Some other key examples, we've got Britain, France, Italy, Australia, Canada, and especially these Western states especially support our countries that are on the border with the Soviet bloc. So West Germany is right here. They're right next to East Germany and the Soviet bloc or the Eastern bloc. So West Germany gets an extra amount of support from the United States so that they can stay capitalist. Other countries that are right there on the border, Greece, Turkey ends up joining the First World, South Korea, these countries that are right on the border with the Second World get a lot of extra support so that they stay strong in their capitalist convictions. The Second World, or the Eastern Bloc, or the Warsaw Pact, those are communist states. They're led by the Soviet Union. That's the biggest. They want everyone to be economically equal. Everyone has the same economic standing. There's no rich, there's no poor. Everyone is part of the system that's supposed to be equal. This system of equality only works if everyone buys in, right? If only the poor people agree to be communist and they redistribute the wealth, everyone's still going to be poor. They need the poor people and the rich people and the middle class. Everyone needs to buy in, pool their money, and then the leveling effect will make it so that everyone's about in the middle. Okay. Like our capitalists, our Second World encourage and support each other. So China supports Eastern Europe, supports Vietnam, supports the Soviet Union, and just like the West, they especially lend support to these countries that are on the edge. So North Korea, that's right next to South Korea, they get a lot of support. East Germany, that's right next to West Germany, they get a lot of support to make sure that they stay strong in communism. Both of these worlds, the First World led by the U.S., and then the Second World led by the Soviet Union, have sufficient nuclear power to destroy the entire Earth. So even though they're really fiercely competing throughout the 20th century, they don't want to have an all-out war because then everyone would die. And part of this tension in the Cold War is this fear that if the leaders don't call the right shots, if they don't meet the right balance, even though they're trying to compete and win, if they get too aggressive and we go to nuclear war, everyone's going to die. So there's a lot of high anxiety during the Cold War that if things don't go well, if someone makes a bad call, everyone could end up dying. Today, spoiler alert, by the end of the lecture, we're going to look at the Soviet Union falling. And then because the Soviet Union is the biggest country in this Eastern Bloc, when they fall, the Cold War, and when they start to lose control, the Cold War effectively ends, right? And when it becomes clear that the Soviet Union is no longer as powerful as the United States, that competition ends. They lose. And look at how. Ready? Excellent. We're going to start in talking about some of the inherent weakness of the Soviet economy. So the Soviets have what's called a command economy. That's another word for a communist economy. Command economy means it is the government that calls all the shots about the economy. The government is in control. Remember, the goal of capitalism is to make sure that everyone is economically equal. No one is poor, and if no one's rich on the other side either. So the government controls that. It tells people how to produce things, what type of goods to produce, how many to produce, when to sell it, who to sell it to, how much they can charge for it when they sell it. The government tells you how much you will pay your workers, and they tell you how long they'll work for. All of these economic problems about jobs, about buying and selling things, about trading, about creating new products, that's all directed by the government. It's called a command economy because the government is in control, in command of the economy. I put a picture up here of the Kremlin for you so that you can remember the Kremlin's like the Capitol building of the Soviet Union. So the people who work in the Kremlin, the people who work in the Capitol, the government in the Soviet Union, they're in charge of the economy. Okay, we're going to look at 3 key problems that this command economy creates. Okay, problem number 1, a lack of innovation. A lack of innovation. Think about the United States. Think about the society that we live in today in Tucson. If you have a great idea, maybe you have an idea about how to create the best car wash in the whole world, and no one else has this idea. What are you going to do? You're going to start a business. You're going to open the best car wash in the world. Your idea is going to be unique, and you can try and get rich. And people do that all the time, right? We see people have great ideas. Someone has the best idea about how to make a dessert. It's going to be like delicious Italian ice, and there's going to be strawberry, lemon, and pina colada flavors, and no one else had this idea. They put it together. It's delicious. They open EG's. It's a business, and the owner of EG's gets rich and makes a ton of money, right? That's how it works here. But if you live in a communist state, no one's allowed to get rich. So even if you have a great idea and you think you could start a good business, you won't be allowed to get rich. The government, any extra money you take through your own intelligence or your own grit, the government's going to take that away and redistribute it. So in a communist state, people don't have the same incentive to try out big new ideas, to open their own businesses, to try and get rich. And so a lot of those ideas either never happen or they're never fully developed. So a lot of that source of innovation, new ideas, innovation means new ideas, doesn't happen in the Soviet system because people say, yeah, it's an idea, but it's not going to do me any personal good, so I don't really care about it. But as part of a command economy, the government, they do have new ideas. It's the government that's in charge of coming up with the new ideas. The government is in charge of saying, here's the new idea that we're all going to put our effort into. Where does the government get ideas? Sometimes people in the government come up with new ideas. A lot of times the Soviet government spies on other countries and they say, oh my gosh, the U.S. is building this type of this type of airplane. Let's build one here too. So the Soviet does a lot of copying other countries, especially the U.S. There's a lot of spying to see what other people are doing, what's being successful in other countries, and then taking it back to the Soviet Union and copying it. This means if the people in the government who are in charge of commanding and driving innovation, if they don't think of something, or if the U.S. keeps something really secret and no one finds out about it, then the Soviet Union is just going to miss out on that new technology. It just doesn't happen. So sometimes they keep up, but by and large, they start to get left behind. And the USSR slowly begins to fall behind technologically and in terms of innovations. Excellent. Second big problem that comes out of this command economy is corruption and greed. Right? So remember, our goal is that everyone pools their resources and then the government is in charge of redistributing it to all the different people in the Soviet Union. And no one's supposed to be rich. But what happens is those government workers that get everything in one place, and they've got this huge amount of material in one place, and then they're in charge of passing it out to other people, they just keep a little bit extra for themselves. So we get greed and corruption. The government that's supposed to just be passing stuff out to make sure it's equal, they take some for themselves too. That's the corruption, is that the government shouldn't be doing that, but they do. And the greed is that they take more than they need. They take more than they'll use. And so I've been saying a lot that in communism there is no rich and there is no poor. That's only a little bit true. There are rich people in communism, and usually it's the people in the government who take that part for themselves instead of splitting it up equally. So there's rich. They get rich from corruption. It's not part of Karl Marx's ideal communist system, but it happens every time. Something about human nature. People like taking care of themselves, eh? Excellent. So we talked about lack of innovation, corruption, and greed. The third problem we're going to talk about that develops out of this command economy is scarcity. And this comes from both of the previous two problems that we've talked about. So when there's less innovation, there's less products available because people are creating less new ideas, and there's not businesses that are trying to fill needs. People are less driven to create a business to fill needs, so there's less products available. With that corruption where government officials are taking some of the extras for themselves or taking some of the not extras, some of the essentials for themselves, and then there's not enough to pass out to everyone else, there's less products available. And in general, scarcity becomes a really big problem in the Soviet Union. Luxury goods, things that are luxury goods in the Soviet Union, are standard in the West. So like a car in the 1950s and 60s. Anyone in the US who wants a car can basically get a car. In the Soviet Union, it's a lot more difficult to get a car. They're a lot more scarce. And basics that are plentiful in the West take effort to find in the Soviet Union. They're available. Things like toilet paper, red meat, pens and pencils. Anywhere in the West, you can walk into a store and pick some of those things out and buy them. In the Soviet Union, you can get them, but you've got to know, if you want to buy red meat, you have to go to the market on Wednesday morning. And if you don't get there on time, then you're not going to have beef for the rest of the week. So it takes a lot more planning and a lot more strategizing. Really exciting part about 2020. So I thought long and hard when I was becoming a teacher and studying Soviet history and stuff. I thought, how could you ever teach people who have grown up in the United States about what it's like to walk into a grocery store and not have basic goods like toilet paper? And then 2020 happened, and I walked into a grocery store, and there was no toilet paper. And I said, oh my gosh, there's no toilet paper. It's like we're in the Soviet Union. And I thought, oh my gosh, my students will understand this. So if you went grocery shopping about this time last year, and the grocery stores were cleared out, then you understand what it was like on a regular basis in the Soviet Union, because this scarcity of goods is the norm. And to get basic goods, people have to plan and think out how to get things. Excellent. Kind of rad. You have lived through something that teaches you more about history. Everything you live through teaches you more about history. But 2020 was incredibly exciting for that. Okay, are we good? I guess there's none of you here listening to me live, so there's no questions, so we'll go to the next slide. Okay, in our next 3 slides, we're going to look at 3 layers of change that led to Soviet decline. The next 3 slides, we're going to look at changes in leadership and policy, internal discontent, and the Soviet-Afghan War. Okay, all of these things happen essentially at the same time. Okay, they all overlap. It's not that there's changes in leadership and then there's internal discontent and then there's the Soviet-Afghan War. These things all happen largely at the same time. So we're like painting a wall with 3 layers of paint, or painting your nails with 3 layers of paint. We're going to go over one, and we're going to go back to the beginning and go over the next, and then go over the last. Okay, so they're all happening at the same time, and we'll try and make connections between them. Okay, we'll start with changes in leadership and policy. Last time we were talking about leadership and policy in the Soviet Union, we talked about Lenin, who started the Bolshevik Revolution, and then Joseph Stalin, who takes over after Lenin's death. And remember, this is our picture of Stalin. All of our Soviet leaders are really easy to recognize. Stalin is easy to recognize because he's got a giant mustache. He's the premier of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. Remember, we talked about him implementing 5-year plans. He implemented total communism, where he got rid of the new economic policy and made it so that everything was shared equally to the best of the government's ability to do so. And he also led these series of purges, wherein anyone who disagreed with him was exported from the country or executed or sent to work in a labor camp or gulag. Okay, so under Stalin, we get a really strict climate, and understanding that there's a lot of fear and that there's this power. That Stalin has power, and the people closest to Stalin have power. And the further away you get from Stalin, the less power you have, and the more easily you can be swept out of the existence of Soviet citizenship. Okay, so under Stalin, we've got a big issue of fear and power. So much so that people don't like him, and he becomes unpredictable. Sometimes people who are really close to him, he decides that they're spying on him, and he says, that person's bad, get rid of them, and people get exported at the flip of a coin. So he's feared, but he's not liked either. People don't like Stalin. They don't trust him because he's volatile and he's cruel. He lets his own son die because he doesn't like him. He's a cruel man. You have to go vote for one of the worst guys in the 20th century. Stalin's up there. He's a bad dude. So this leads to his death. How does it lead to his death? Does he get killed? No. He's at a government meeting. He's in a room with a couple other top officials, and he collapses and has some sort of medical emergency, a heart attack or a stroke or something. Something bad happens. And the other people around him are also really powerful, but they know that Stalin's unpredictable and no one trusts him and no one really likes him. So he's on the front ground kind of having this medical emergency, and the people all look at each other and they're like, well, we're just going to walk away and close the door. And so they do. And then they find him later. The staff of the house find him later, and they're like, oh my gosh. And by then, strokes, heart attacks, those type of things, the sooner you get treatment, the better off you are. They left Stalin for a good little while there, and he dies as a result. He does not recover from that. That's the end of Stalin. And after his death, his next guy who becomes in charge of the Soviet Union is Nikita Khrushchev. He's right here. I said each of our Soviet people are easy to remember. Khrushchev's easy to remember because he's bald. Can't remember who's who. Khrushchev is bald. Nikita Khrushchev is bald. And he's the premier of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964. And the main thing that he is famous for is his program of de-Stalinization. He wants to remove Stalin's reputation and Stalin's strictness and Stalin's severity from the Soviet Union, right? We said that Stalin created an atmosphere of strictness and a climate of fear. Khrushchev doesn't want that. He doesn't think that's the way to take the country, and he realizes that Stalin didn't get help when he was dying, and Khrushchev says, oh, maybe that's not what I want. So Khrushchev begins this program of de-Stalinization, removing Stalin's reputation. Some of these things are physical and cosmetic, right? So major city called Stalingrad. Remember in World War II we talked about the Battle of Stalingrad? Did we talk about that? I think we did. The Battle of Stalingrad, so that was after a city named after Stalin. Khrushchev renames that. He says, we're not going to call this Stalingrad anymore. Stalin had requested that his body be kept on display, just like Lenin's. I told you guys Vladimir Lenin died, but they kept his body out on display, and you can still go visit it in the Soviet or in Russia today. Stalin wanted his body out on display too. Khrushchev says no and has Stalin's body wheeled away and taken off of display. And Stalin had statues of himself put up all around the Soviet Union so everyone would know that he was in charge of the country. Khrushchev has a lot of those statues removed. So a lot of that's cosmetic, right? Renaming things that had been named after Stalin, taking away Stalin's body, taking down Stalin's statues. And then some of Khrushchev's policies are a little more affecting people. So some people that were sent to gulags because they disagreed with Stalin, Khrushchev lets them come back to normal civilian life. A lot of people get released from prison and from work labor camps because Khrushchev is de-Stalinizing. He says, you were in prison because you offended Stalin, but Stalin is dead. We're de-Stalinizing now, so you can come out of prison. In fact, he frees so many prisoners that several gulags are closed. He says, everyone in this work camp is here because Stalin didn't like them. So you're all going to go, and then we don't need this gulag anymore, so we can close it. So he's removing some of that strictness and fear from Stalin, or that had existed under Stalin. That's what de-Stalinization is all about. Now, the Soviet Union is still a really strict place. People still don't feel so free to speak their mind. The government is still totally in control of things like newspapers and businesses, of course. But there's a slight easing of the tension that Stalin had created under the 11 years of Khrushchev. The next person to take power in the Soviet Union is Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev, he's the premier from 1964 to 1982. His distinctive facial feature, right? Stalin's got a big mustache. Khrushchev is bald. Brezhnev has caterpillars for eyebrows. Look at those things. Isn't that impressive? That's fantastic. Brezhnev has caterpillars for eyebrows. That's how you can tell who he is. Excellent. So Khrushchev doesn't die. He gets forced out of office. Leonid Brezhnev was high up in the Soviet power ranks, and he uses his political power and his political clout to make a couple key alliances with other people in the government. And they have a meeting with Khrushchev, and they say, Khrushchev, it's time for you to stop being premier. And if you don't stop being premier, it could be very bad for your health. And so Khrushchev gets the idea that they might hurt him. So he says, okay, I'll resign. So they kind of force Khrushchev out. And then Brezhnev comes in as power. Brezhnev does not undo de-Stalinization. Khrushchev has effectively undone Stalin's strict and tense environment that he had the Soviet Union in. And Brezhnev doesn't try to re-intensify any of that. He doesn't send a bunch of people to prison. He doesn't start another round of purges. He keeps things kind of at the status quo where Khrushchev has them. But it doesn't work out perfectly for him. Under him, the Soviet Union gets into a period of economic stagnation. What does that mean? It means the economy is stagnant. It's not growing. It's not prospering. New businesses aren't starting. Of course, there aren't really new businesses in the Soviet Union, but government-run businesses aren't flourishing. Productivity is down. Inflation starts to rise. People are no longer enjoying the same quality of life that they used to. Problems like depression get worse because people don't have meaningful economic options. And this stagnant economy, where does it come from? Well, there's lots of theories. I'm going to tell you my favorite. And it's great. It makes historically sound sense. Without the Stalinist fear, people under Stalin were really afraid that if they did the wrong thing, they would get sent to jail. People under Stalin were afraid that if they did the wrong thing, their families would be taken away from them. And so everyone lives in this fear and kind of this frenzied work ethic. They say, we've got to do everything we can to make the Soviet Union successful. If we don't make it successful, if we don't comply with these government policies, we might get killed. And there's the example of the Ukrainians, where these kulaks in Ukraine didn't go along and they starved to death, right? 10 million of them. So there's this understanding that under Stalin, that you had to do your best and really make things work. Under Khrushchev, and then later under Brezhnev, that fear and that tension is removed. And without it, people began to relax a little bit. Now, the government structure stayed essentially the same in terms of its goals of making sure everyone had enough money, everyone had food to eat. So now we have people who are guaranteed a job, who are guaranteed that they're never going to be poor, and they're no longer afraid of being sent to a gulag. So they've got this release. What does that happen? People lose their motivation. They say, if I'm not going to get punished, and working hard isn't going to make me rich, I'm not going to work hard. So we have a lot of people in the Soviet Union who aren't motivated. They don't really do fantastic work. And because of that, a lot of businesses suffer, right? They don't have people who are putting their all into the workforce. They don't have people that are, and when I say businesses, that's not the right word. There are a lot of industries suffer. A lot of industries don't prosper. People don't do really high quality work. They don't create high quality things. And so that industry does not do really well. Because people are guaranteed work. They're guaranteed they're not going to starve to death. And then they also lose their fear of getting sent to a gulag. So they don't have a lot of motivation. Similarly, because people in the government are no longer afraid that Stalin is going to turn on them and dislike them and send to a gulag, people in the government get a lot more corrupt too. Those people that are in charge of redistributing goods say, you know what, there's not really any big punishments anymore, so I can just take extra for me and my family. So people in the government get more and more corrupt. That corruption and greed that we talked about in the last slide increases in its occurrence. So these things, greed in the government and then lack of motivation in the workforce, lead to this stagnation where the economy just gets on a blah, not great. Especially in the 80s, we see an increase in things like scarcity. Yeah, excellent. And then our last premier, not the last premier we're going to talk about, the last premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's in power from 1985 until 1991. There's a little bit of a gap here between Brezhnev and Gorbachev. There's some other people that we could talk about, but they're only in there for like 9 months at a time. So Gorbachev is the next person who's in there for more than a year. Okay. And Mikhail Gorbachev, what's his facial thing we can remember him by? Slow down, my friend. Stalin's got a giant mustache. Khrushchev is bald. Brezhnev has caterpillars for eyebrows. Gorbachev has a birthmark that looks like a bird pooped on his head. You can always tell it's a picture of Gorbachev because he's got this funky birthmark, and you're like, oh man, he doesn't know that something spilled on his head from the balcony. Nope, it's just his birthmark. Excellent. He's premier from 1985 to 1991. His main thing is he wants to fix the stagnation that Brezhnev had let develop. So he wants to fix that stagnation. Now, we've got two options, right? We said there's two things that led to that stagnation. One, workers weren't motivated because, what? Because they didn't feel they were guaranteed a job, right? They're guaranteed a job. And because they're not afraid of getting sent to a gulag. So he could have become more Stalinistic and said, nope, if you're lazy, you're going to get sent to a gulag. He decided that's probably not the right way to go. And instead, he says, well, let's open up some free market competition so that people, if they want to do extra work, they can make more money. We'll take away our promise of equality and open up some free market allowances. The name for this policy is perestroika. Perestroika means restructuring. And Gorbachev is talking about an economic restructuring. He says, communism, pure communism, the way that Marx envisioned it is not working. People are actually getting kind of lazy. We don't have a good work ethic. We've got economic stagnation. We're falling behind in terms of innovation. We're going to restructure a little bit. Some of the things that Gorbachev allows for in perestroika are private property. He says, if you want to build something and own something, you can do that. He says the government still owns businesses, right? Businesses are still owned by the government, but those people in charge of businesses, they can make some of their own choices without getting it okayed by the central government, and they can respond to supply and demand. So instead of the government saying, you will make 50 typewriters a year, he says, well, why don't you take a survey and see how many people want typewriters, and then make that many. So if 75 people want typewriters, go ahead and make 75 typewriters. Respond to the demand of the market. So businesses, state-run businesses, are given this permission to respond to the market in the hopes that if there's a demand for 75 typewriters, that business will start to supply 75 typewriters, and we can get rid of some of that scarcity. He also does one more really important thing. These are government-owned businesses, right? Government-run businesses. But he says, if you are in charge of government-owned business, you work for the government, and you do a terrible job, you will lose your job, and your business will fail. Even though it's government-owned, we're going to expect you to run it well, to cover your costs, to make good economic business choices, and if you don't, you will fail. Before, businesses that made bad choices, the government bailed them out. And it said, well, we'll just get more money from taxing everyone or from collecting everyone's money. And instead of redistributing extra money to people, we'll use that money. Instead of redistributing it, we'll prop up this business that is failing. So Gorbachev under perestroika says, no, if you run the business badly, that business is going to fail and you will lose your job. So it's a little bit of a step back from communism. The other policy that Gorbachev is really famous for is called glasnost. Glasnost means openness. And in glasnost, Gorbachev gave up control of the press. So that means that newspapers and journals and even TV organizations were allowed to start saying what they thought without fear of punishment from the government. Before, the state was in charge of all the news media, and anything that got published had to be approved by the government. Under glasnost, people are allowed to say what they think, even if it criticizes the government. What happens under glasnost is that there's a huge outpouring of criticism. People say, hey, have you noticed that we can't buy toilet paper? But I heard over the radio that anyone who wants to buy toilet paper in France can buy toilet paper. And so they start getting all this information about how things are outside the Soviet Union. And these two combinations, people starting to abandon the communist economy, and then this information about what's available outside the Soviet Union, really becomes the sinking element for the Soviet Union. And under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union will dissolve. We'll get there momentarily. Ready? Excellent. Another category we're going to look at is this internal discontent. Internal discontent. Oh, excellent. We're right on time. So internal, meaning within the Soviet Union, what's happening in the Soviet Union. People are not content. They're unhappy. We got a few maps up here. Excellent. So map 1 right here that's on the gray background. I guess it's on the white background and the other countries are in gray. This is a map of the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Soviet Union controls Russia proper and then these adjoining territories. So this is like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and other countries, Uzbekistan, Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia are right up here. So they used to be separate countries, but now they're all part of the Soviet Union. This pink mass right here in the middle, this is Russia. So the Soviet Union controls Russia proper. All of these other little areas are also part of the official Soviet Union. Today, most of these are separate countries. Back then, in the mid-20th century, they're all part of the Soviet Union. Okay, so we've got the Ukraine as well. They're all part of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union controls, is the government for all of these countries, 1 through 15 on this map. Okay. In addition to this being the territory of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is the biggest and most powerful communist country, they also have a lot of role in telling other countries what to do. Right? So these other countries over here are technically separate countries. Over here, anyone that doesn't have the hammer and the sickle on its flag are not part of the Soviet Union, right? So this is East Germany. East Germany is not part of the Soviet Union, but they kind of have to do what the Soviet Union tells them to. Poland is right here. Czechoslovakia is underneath. These are technically independent countries, but they're part of that Eastern Bloc. They've got communist governments, and there's this known threat that if they disagree with the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union is going to show up and tell them what to do. And in fact, we see 2 examples of that, our 2 first bullet points on our slide. All right, so the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Hungarian Revolution is a general uprising in Hungary. People say, we don't want to be we don't want to be communist anymore. Oh, I'm going to cough. In this Hungarian Revolution, the people rise up. It's a general uprising. They don't want communism. They collapse their communist government. They get rid of it. They set up a new government. But the Soviet army invades, crushes the rebellion, gets rid of their new ideas about government, and reinstalls a communist government. So the 1956 Hungarian Revolution had everything that we expect to see in a successful revolution. The people rose up. They didn't like the government was there. They threw off the government. They created something new. But even though they're a separate country from the Soviet Union showed up and said, no. We're not doing that. You're going to stay communist. And if you try this again, we'll just send the army back. Super similar thing happens in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. I guess it's a little bit different. The Czechoslovakians elect Alex Dubček to be the president of Czechoslovakia. And as part of his campaign promises and what people expect him to do, he says that he's going to grant greater personal rights and freedoms. Right? He's going to take a step back from this communist collective mindset and tell people that they can make their individual choices and have individual rights. The Soviets do not like that, and they say, that's not what you're going to do in your government. The Soviet army, again, enters Prague, or Czechoslovakia, Prague, the capital city, gets rid of Dubček, says, you are not going to be the president. They set up a new president who is more in line with Soviet actions, and reversed all of the reforms that Dubček put in. So these first 2 examples show us that in countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, countries that aren't officially part of the Soviet Union, they still get forced into following what the Soviet Union wants them to do. They also show us that as early as 1956, people do not want to be part of this Eastern Bloc. People want to get rid of communism. They don't like it. That's the internal discontent. People living in communist countries are not happy with living in communist countries, and they want to get out as early as 1956. These two examples from the 50s and 60s are not successful, and the people who wanted to get out from communism are stuck under communism, but they show us that there's this growing trend. In 1980 is where the next big event happens, and this happens in Poland. Up here, Poland. Specifically in a shipbuilding yard. So at an industry where people work building ships. And the workers at the shipbuilding yard in Poland do not like their working conditions. They want improved working conditions. And so what do? They form a union, right? That sounds pretty straightforward. That's what workers usually do if they don't like their working condition. And they name their union Solidarity. Here's their flag up here, written in Polish. They name their union Solidarity. And like all unions, Solidarity advocates for workers' rights and for better working conditions. So what's the big deal? Here's the big deal. Poland is a communist country. Communist governments are all about the workers, right? Marx's call is workers of the world unite. If you live in a communist government, the government is your union. The government should be representing workers. The government should make sure that all workers have good working conditions. So the fact that conditions are bad under a communist government, they're so bad that people form a union to advocate for better working conditions, is antithetical to the idea of communism. The very existence of this union challenges the Soviet identity, right? The Soviet Union says, we're a communist state. We are the best place to be if you're a worker. And yet there's a workers' union that says, no, conditions here aren't great. So the very ideological backing of the Soviet Union is challenged by the existence of Solidarity. And then its actions, when the workers on Solidarity go on strike, when they advocate for better causes, and they really say, no, look, conditions aren't good, they further emphasize that the Soviet Union is not living up to the Communist Commission to create an ideal place for workers to live. As you might expect, the Soviet Union is not happy, and the government of Poland is not happy. They say, you are ruining the reputation of our communist government, and they crack down against Solidarity, and a lot of leaders have to go underground, but the union keeps existing. Just because it's illegal, people keep existing in it, and it doesn't help that they get some funding from the United States. The U.S. is like, oh, you don't like the communists? You want some money? So Solidarity keeps existing. Excellent. So into this environment, we know that there are some people that do not like communism, even though they live under communism, add in this persistent union Solidarity. And then our sprinkling ingredient, our last special ingredient, is Gorbachev's introduction of perestroika and glasnost. And perestroika, people get a glimpse of what it could be like if they worked hard. Maybe they could get rich for themselves. And then under glasnost, people are allowed to say what they think. Solidarity, the leaders are allowed to come out in the open and have open criticisms of the state. It leads to a flood of criticisms and open unions. Solidarity becomes one of many unions and organizations that are advocating against communism. When this perestroika and glasnost are introduced by 1989, many of these Eastern European countries, so these ones on the map that aren't officially part of the Soviet Union, start getting rid of their communist governments. Poland gets rid of their communist government. Hungary gets rid of their communist government. East Germany gets rid of their communist government. Czechoslovakia gets rid of their communist government. Bulgaria gets rid of their communist government. Romania gets rid of their communist government. So all over Eastern Europe, when this relaxing happens, when the Soviets stop cracking down, many of these Eastern communist states leave. And then 2 years later in 1991, after most of these Eastern European countries have abandoned communism, then these little countries start breaking off. The Baltics and the Caucasus start breaking off. start breaking off. Lithuania, Latvia, Croatia, they start advocating for independence. And then in 1991, Gorbachev finally says, we're going to stop being the Soviet Union. We'll restructure and make some sort of different type of government. And that's how the internal discontent goes. Oh, hold on, folks, we can do it. We got 2 more slides. We're right on time. Excellent. Next, our Soviet-Afghan War. So we said we're looking at 3 layers, right? We looked at the changes in political leaders from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev to Gorbachev. And then we looked at how some people living under communism did not like living under communism. And then we're going to look at the Soviet-Afghan War as our 3rd layer here. And this is one of the Soviet Union's biggest failings in international policy. Okay. Remember, the Soviet Union's Cold War goal is to expand communism globally and to support communist uprisings and to assist communist regimes. One of the places they do this is in Afghanistan, and we've looked at this before. Right, here's our map. Afghanistan is in pink. Pakistan is right next to it. Remember, that was created when India was made independent and gets split into 2. We've got some other stands around it. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. And then up above these things, we've got Russia proper. At this time period, these other stands, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, these are all part of the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union is moving further and further south. In 1978, the Soviets helped to support the Sour Revolution in Afghanistan. So they backed up a communist group. That communist group led an attack on the previous government of Afghanistan that was successful. They killed the current president, and they killed most of the president's family as well, and they set up a new government, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, a communist government. Now, something that we haven't really emphasized a lot with communism, but is very much part of communist ideology, is that communism is essentially atheist. Karl Marx writes that under an ideal system, there is no religion, especially no state-sponsored religion. So the communist government is inherently atheist. This Democratic Republic of Afghanistan is an atheist government backed by the Soviet Union. Now, if you were paying attention in class on Tuesday, and on Monday, you know where this is going. And we get significant resistance to the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, especially from Islamic people living in Afghanistan, which is most of the people living in Afghanistan. Okay, these Islamic resistance fighters take on the name Mujahideen. You'll remember in our 5 pillars of Islam, we talk about faith in God, prayer facing Mecca, fasting during the month of Ramadan, taking the Hajj once in your life, and jihad, or struggling for religious rightness. Jihad also sometimes means fighting against people who disagree with Islam. And then a jihadist is someone who's doing jihad, who's fighting for Islam. Another word for jihadist in the Middle Eastern language, what's the word in Arabic, is mujahideen. So these mujahideen people, and we've got pictures of 3 here, are people who are Islamic and who are fighting for the cause of Islam. These mujahideen, they oppose non-Islamic government. So they oppose the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, they oppose state atheism, and they oppose Soviet influence. They say the Soviets are not Muslim, they don't belong in our country. Later on, these Mujahideen fighters, some of them will turn into Al-Qaeda, some of them will turn into the Taliban. They start off just as this general term, Mujahideen. And Mujahideen is just a word that means someone who's fighting for the purpose of Islam. There's no centralized Mujahideen structure. There's no one ruler of these Mujahideen rebels. It's just people who disagree with the Soviet interaction with the atheist government and who are fighting against it. And so in the Mujahideen, there's a lot of guerrilla fighting. Guerrilla fighting. I put this word guerrilla up on the board first. Guerrilla, not like the animal. Guerrilla, like it's a Spanish word, right? Guerra means war. Guerrilla means a little war. So these Mujahideen are guerrilla fighters. Wherever they are, they fight little fights against the government. Little fights. Kind of like, I don't know, like a mosquito. Like, they're just going to get there and be annoying and pester you and maybe kill a few people, and then they're going to go back and disappear into the community. They're not an organized army. They're not a central group. They're small groups all over the country that effectively attack, annoy, and destroy sections of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Soviets that are stationed in Afghanistan. These Mujahideen fighters provide such persistent motion against the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. They're so consistent in opposing it that the Soviets realized that if the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, if that government is going to maintain power, they're going to need more support. So the Soviet army, or at least part of it, comes into Afghanistan to help fight against the Mujahideen. This is where it becomes a failed policy. These guerrilla rebels are difficult to find. They're difficult to attack. They're all over the country. There's no centralized power. So to get rid of them, it's not like you just get rid of the key leader and they're all gone. You have to track down every single group and either squash them out or destroy them all. That's really difficult, especially because they're across so much of the land of the country and they represent such a large portion of the country. Many people in Afghanistan support the Mujahideen. And even if they're not actively in the Mujahideen, they're supporting them, and they're not going to betray them to the Soviets. The Soviets fight against them for 9 years. This becomes an economic drain on a Soviet Union that's already struggling economically. After 9 years, victory seems impossible. It seems like they're never going to win. If this sounds like the Vietnam War from the U.S. perspective, a lot of people make that comparison. And they'll call the Soviet-Afghan War the Vietnam War of the Soviet Union, where they get stuck overseas fighting a fight that doesn't seem possible, and it doesn't seem like the people of Afghanistan want them fighting there. In fact, it seems so much like the people of Afghanistan don't want them there that the war becomes internationally unpopular. And other countries outside of the Soviet Union start to say, hey, why are you guys fighting in there? The Afghans don't want you in there. They don't like their government. Just let them be in charge of their own country. And some Western states that had started to trade with the Soviet Union say, we're going to impose sanctions. That means we're not going to trade with you as long as you're maintaining the Soviet-Afghan war. These sanctions from international community become an even further drain on the weakening Soviet economy. So, as a result of all these pressures and the seeming hopelessness of it, in 1989, Brezhnev pulls Soviet troops out of Afghanistan. However, many people think it was too late and that those 9-10 years of fighting in Afghanistan led to such a drain that that's one of the reasons that the Soviet Union collapses. So that's the end of our Soviet history. Just for your information, the effects on Afghanistan, so after the Soviet Union pull out, the fighting against the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan by the Mujahideen continue. They officially formed groups like Al-Qaeda, and that formed in 1988, right? Al-Qaeda keeps functioning there. The Taliban and other Islamic fundamentalist groups are formed. They continue. Eventually, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan is gotten rid of, but then there's infighting between groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They can't decide who's in charge. Add to that struggle that Al-Qaeda starts attacking other countries. In 2001, they attacked the United States, the Twin Towers in New York City. So in 2001, the U.S. troops go into Afghanistan looking for Osama bin Laden. And they get caught up in this war, and it's still going on. So this war that started in 1978 is still going on today. And there's still groups fighting each other in Afghanistan, and the United States still has troops in Afghanistan as well. So, I don't know, we've been there, since 2001, 20 years? We outlasted the Soviets. That's something, right? Okay, excellent. We have one more slide. We can do this. Okay. Our last slide is about the end of the Cold War. Look, we just get a little bit. So remember, Cold War tensions are between communist and capitalist countries. I've been telling us that the Cold War ends in 1989, and I say that because of this breakaway of the Eastern Bloc in 1989, right? These countries, starting with Poland, but also Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany, they ditch their communist governments, and the Soviet Union doesn't stop them. And this kind of, right, if the Cold War is a competition between capitalism and communism, this shows that the capitalists win in two ways. One, people living in the communist countries don't want to be communists. They want to be capitalists. That seems like a pretty compelling evidence that capitalism seemed like a better system. 2, the Soviet Union doesn't have the strength to stop them. In 1989, the Soviet Union doesn't have the strength to stop them. In the 1980s and the 1990s, when Latin American countries try to become more communist, the U.S. has the strength to go in there and stop them from doing it. The Soviet Union doesn't have that strength, and so it seems clear that the Soviet Union has less international power than the United States. So in those 2 ways, that people in communism don't want communism, and that the Soviet Union doesn't have the power to stop people from stopping communism, shows that the Cold War is going on the side of capitalism. That's winning. Real quick, I want to talk about one symbolic event that really characterizes this end of the Cold War in 1989. That's the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, let's talk about Berlin Wall real quick. So we talked earlier, remember we made a map about the Cold War. We talked about Germany after World War II. Germany, remember, that was Hitler and the Nazis and the Axis powers, and they lost World War II, and part of their punishment was that Germany got split into 2 different countries. West Germany, which joined the First World, and then East Germany, which joined the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc. The same thing, that same split in half, happens in the capital city of Berlin. And Berlin is up here. Berlin gets split into 2 sections. West Germany, which is a capitalist one half of the city, and East Germany, which is communist one half of the city, but in the middle of a communist country. So West Berlin becomes this half of a capitalist city, all by itself in the middle of a communist country. Okay, so it's all by itself. It gets support from the Western countries. They send trucks and airplanes in with supplies so that it has people to trade with, and it's supported. And they say, we're not even going to let half a city fall to communism. So Berlin gets supported. But the Soviet Union, remember, they have problems with scarcity. And they have problems with cracking down on information. They say, we cannot let people be polluted by capitalist West Berlin. So the Soviets build a wall all around West Berlin. And that's what's in this picture here. It's kind of like the demilitarized zone in Korea. It's a wall. You can see on this half of the wall we have West Berlin. On that half of the wall we have East Berlin. And no one from West Berlin is allowed to go to East Berlin. No one from East Berlin is allowed to go to West Berlin. The city is cut in half. And as part of that process, neighbors are cut off from each other, family members are cut off from each other, communities are separated. And this goes on for 20 years. As part of the 1989 Eastern Bloc leaving the Soviet sphere and leaving communism, when East Germany becomes not communist, when they start to vote out communism, they take down this wall and they let people reconnect. Families and friends are reunited, and then as East Germany becomes capitalist, West Berlin fits right in, and eventually East Germany and West Germany get put back together into one united country. This falling of the Berlin Wall is a really important symbolic moment that shows this division that had existed in the Cold War, right? We have a literal division. So much of the Cold War is ideological, capitalism versus communism. This wall is very literal. It divides people and it comes down. As the Soviet Union falls and as the Eastern Bloc leaves, that division comes down. And the world, especially Europe, becomes a more communicable place where people are talking more and ideas are more free to be spread. So I put the end of the Cold War at 1989 because we have those Eastern countries abandoning communism, and it seems clear that communism is no longer the winning ideology. Excellent. Again, we talked about the Soviet Union officially dissolves in 1991. Gorbachev says, we're done with that. And the failure of the Soviet Union, right? They can't survive economically. They make bad international choices. They don't survive as a country. The failure of the Soviet Union seems to officially disprove the viability of communism. If this giant country with tons of natural resources and millions of people couldn't make communism work, then maybe communism really just isn't a good system. Not only didn't make it work, but 30 million people starved to death. right? Or were imprisoned and worked to death in labor camps. That seems like a pretty significant failure. So the fall of the Soviet Union and the failure and the human life failure of the Soviet Union seems to be pretty compelling evidence that communism is not as good. So this fall of the Soviet Union finalizes the end of the Cold War, that it's no longer big under pressure. Excellent. And we could, real quick, one more little point here for you, just for knowing things. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's still tension between the U.S. and communist countries, and that exists today, right? There's tension between the U.S. and China. There's tension between the U.S. and Korea. My favorite thing, Trump versus Biden, in one of the debates, the moderator asked, what's the biggest foreign threat to the United States? And Trump says, China is the biggest foreign threat to the United States. I don't know. And Biden says Russia is the biggest threat to the United States, right? Both candidates identify either Russia or China, the two big ex-communist countries. And I said, we're still in the Cold War. So this tension between the U.S. and communist countries still exists, China and North Korea. And Russia, even though Russia isn't communist anymore. Russia technically today has elections. I put Putin up on here. He's been staring into me. I feel like he's like, oh, scary man, right? So Vladimir Putin, when the Soviet Union fell in 1990s, Vladimir Putin was already in power in the Soviet Union, had a high government power. By 2000, Vladimir Putin becomes the president of Russia. And, 20 years later today, Vladimir Putin is still the president of Russia. So, I don't know, are elections really, if the same person just happens to keep getting voted in, that's usually a pretty good sign in history that there's some sort of lack of integrity going on in that electoral system. But that's our fun fact for the day. Excellent, students. Top-notch. Great work, guys. Hope you have a great 3-day weekend, great Holy Week. I'll see you on Monday. Remember, we've got a test on Wednesday, test on Thursday, and then onward to bigger and better things. We'll see you. Bye!